Pastor asked me to share with you guys this morning in his stead. I had some notes written down that I've had just over a period of time. Ryan, is there any way you could turn this down just a little bit? Thank you. So I had some notes that were written down that I just kind of jotted down as I read the Word, or if I'm in a sermon or something, I jot some stuff down. And I was going through, and I could have compiled it into a word or a sermon or something, whatever you want to call it. But the more I prayed about it, I just really felt the Lord speak in a direction that He wanted me to go. And Pastor's been speaking a lot about testimonies. I just really felt the Lord leading me to share my testimony. And we all have testimonies, and I have several of them, and everybody in this room has a testimony. But I really felt it put upon my heart to share the testimony of my salvation. And some of you have heard it. Some of you know it more than others. But I don't want this to... This isn't a rerun of my life, and I want you guys to kind of think about this for a minute. This isn't a rerun of my life. This isn't saying, oh, he had it so bad, but look what happened. This is like a preview to your life if you're in a struggle right now. Because there's hope, there's a light, and if there's something going on in you right now, it's a testimony being created. And I think most people in this room, they know that. I just wanted to, during praise and worship, I had this thought. If I could have a show of hands of anybody who's ever been in a situation where it seemed hopeless, there was no way out of it, you thought it would be the end of you as life as you know it. Has anybody ever had that situation? Okay. And how did it turn out? In the end, it wasn't that bad. Now, if you're still in the middle of that, I don't expect you to receive that totally. Believe me, I get it. But when you're on the other side and you look back, and you realize, you know what, it wasn't that bad. And it's hard to apply that when you're going through something else. It's hard to apply it to like, well, I already went through that. This can't be that bad. So many of you have heard bits and pieces of my testimony, but I wanted to just say this, that it's a slow fade, okay? And what I mean by that is that the devil never just hits you like a train. It may seem like that. It may seem like all of a sudden, like, boom, something happens, and it's like, you know, and I'm not talking necessarily about an event in your life that like puts you out and you have to like lean on God to get through it, because that's a testimony also. What I'm talking about is that moment where you are compromising. You have turned your back on everything that you've known, and you wake up and you realize you don't even know what you're doing, you don't know what you're thinking, and I just want to say that doesn't happen overnight, and that's really my testimony. The devil is very patient in many ways, and he knows how to steer it. I think of James 3:4, where it says that a ship, a mighty ship or a large ship, is steered by a little rudder. And, you know, if you're on a large ship and you turn the rudder too fast, the ship will turn, and everybody on board knows that the ship has just turned. But if you turn it very gentle, it makes for a smooth ride, a smooth transition. And that's what the devil does. He does this smooth transition and changes the direction of our thoughts and of all sorts of things. Now, I haven't personally seen this, but I was talking to a friend of mine about it. But apparently, there's I think it's a documentary or a show on Netflix. I think it's called The Push, and it was a social experiment done by some psychiatrists to see if they could actually, through peer pressure, get somebody to commit murder. And it was all staged. They hired this guy, and the whole event, everybody that was there were actors except for one guy. And it started with him switching the signs on an hors d'oeuvre tray that he was taking out. So the end goal was murder, but they started with him by just switching the labels on an hors d'oeuvre tray. And he was like, well, all right, I guess. And then as the night progressed, they kept compromising, and they kept making him compromise, and everybody was pushing on him. And by the end of the night, it ended up with him throwing this guy off of a building. And he had a harness or something like that. Obviously, nobody was hurt. And I don't know if he actually pushed the guy or not. But he did compromise. And the more he compromised, the worse his compromises got as time went on. And when I heard about that, I had to kind of chuckle in kind of a dark sort of way, because it was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense from where I come from. Because I was, for the most part, I was raised in a good home. It was definitely not without its trials. But I had a loving family. We were not perfect. We're still not perfect. Let's see where I'm at here. So yeah, I grew up upstate New York. I mean, when you're near the city, everything above Yonkers is upstate. I was about an hour and a half from New York City, and the first few years of my life was like a storybook. It was amazing. I had my brothers and my cousins. We all lived outside, like from sun up to sundown, rain, shine. We were always outside. We were always in the woods, and we weren't even allowed in the house. We'd get called back for dinner, maybe lunch, but all day we were outside, and when the sun started to go down, my mom would whistle, and we'd come back, and we'd get deconned from ticks and all sorts of other ungodly things that were stuck to us. And it was like I was living in a dream. When I look back on it, like in the time, it was just life. My dad was he was a Fed. He was a drug enforcement officer. He was also a combat veteran from Vietnam. My mother was a corrections officer, so discipline in my house and stuff was there. Not to mention my father was a hot-blooded Italian from the Bronx, so there was that aspect of things. And so in about early 90s, life really just took a drastic turn, because my father was actually, he was, I say gunned down, because that's what happened to him. He got gunned down in a hunting accident. I'm not going to get into all that, but some guy in the woods shot my father 3 times in the back with a shotgun, and my dad lived, and he walked himself out of the woods, and he drove himself to the state trooper barracks, because he wasn't happy about the situation. And they made him go to the hospital. So after that happened, that's really where my childhood started to get dark. And the devil started with making me not feel safe in my home. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to tell you ahead of time. Obviously, I'm going to get emotional at this. So just bear with me. It's just how it happens. Everybody does, when they think about struggles. So my father was shot. He also suffered from PTSD from the Vietnam War, and he had a terrible temper. And he started to take medication to deal with the pain and stuff like that, but he just couldn't. They weren't able to operate on him because back then the technology that we have today for operation and surgeries, they didn't exist. So I think he had something like 56 or something like that pellets lodged in his back, his head, his neck, his wrist, all up and down his right side. And he really just could not function. He tried really hard to maintain a job, but he just couldn't work. So his career in law enforcement, which comes with a really good salary and an excellent retirement, he basically had to medically retire. And he got addicted to all sorts of prescription medications. He tried to cope with alcohol. And that was really where the darkest times of my life started to set in. And when he would run out of pain medication, he'd turn to tequila. And I remember some nights of just watching this man rage in a way that I've never seen another man rage. and he would destroy the house. He would splinter furniture. There would be putting holes in the wall. If you were unfortunate enough to be in his path, I mean, you'd get it too. And I remember one time I did something, and I'm laughing, and those of you who know me probably know why I'm laughing, but it's not funny. But my dad actually grabbed me by the hair one time and threw me over a coffee table, and like you'd take a pillow and like slam me into a wall. And I was only like maybe 5 at the time. And when you live in that type of environment, you don't feel safe. During that time also, there was some stuff that was going on in New York City that didn't directly involve my family, but I come from an Italian family on my father's side. And some of our distant relatives were high-ranking members of La Cosa Nostra, or the Mafia. My grandmother's cousin was actually the head of the Bonanno crime family. His name was Joe Bonanno, my grandma's cousin. My grandmother's maiden name is Bonanno. Then my grandpa's cousin, I think it was his cousin, he was a capo in the Gambino crime family. And for the most part, we were sheltered from all that, but that stuff was going on. And there was an incident that happened down in New York City, and I'm sketchy on the details of exactly what happened, but there was a high-profile hit that took place, and they wanted to come up to my grandpa's house, which is where we lived. They wanted to come up to my grandpa's house and hide out till they just wanted to come up for a visit, they said, but it was all over the news headlines that something had gone down, and my grandpa wasn't a fool. And so they wanted to come up, and my grandpa, in a very New York City sort of way, told them, no thank you, you can stay in New York City. And then death threats started coming in. And I was a little kid, but I overheard the adults talking about how they had to tighten security around the house and blah, 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 didn't keep an eye on the kids because people wanted to hurt us. In hindsight, it was probably just a scare tactic, but when you're a kid, you don't know that. So I just lived in fear. I was a straight-A student, believe it or not, for a couple years. I had awards all over, up and down my door. On my bedroom door. I used to stick them to my door, and I always finished my schoolwork the fastest. And I was an A student. I don't know if I go so far as say an A+ student. But as my home life started to deteriorate, so did school. I started getting picked on. I started getting bullied. I started getting beat up every single day at school, and I literally mean every single day. Every day was a fight to get to the school bus, and every day was a fight to get from the school bus to class. So I majored in fighting in school. I minored in fighting. I majored in getting beat up. So that went on for years, and no matter where I went to school. And because of the things that were happening at home with my father, obviously my mother wasn't able to live with a man like that. And I just want to say this, my father was a good man. He loved us, he loved his kids. He was broken and he needed Jesus. That really. So I never ever want to disrespect the memory of my father. He was a good man, and he taught me a lot. Some things better than others. So my mother left my father. They got separated, but my mother's from Colorado. So it wasn't like we moved down the road. We moved 2,000 miles away out west to Colorado. And I traveled to Colorado with planes, trains, automobiles, and I'm sure if there was a way to get there by boat, we probably would have tried that too. I changed school districts 13 times in 11 years. So obviously my grades started to plummet. I was not able to keep friends. I wasn't able to make friends. The moment I'd show up to a new place, I was the new kid, and I became a punching bag. And kids are just mean. I mean, they can be anyway. I get along with kids now, but back then, not so much. But literally my whole life was a fight. Literally my whole life, I was always looking over my shoulder because I thought one day some guys in a three-piece suit were going to show up and, put the whack to me, okay? Obviously that didn't happen, and again, that was probably just a scare tactic because they were trying to get back on my grandfather. But I didn't know it, and I wasn't going to be like, well, I call your bluff. Actually, really quick, there was an incident when I worked in Colorado in my 20s where I was a host at a restaurant, and these two guys had come in a suit, and the one guy was like, he's like, how you doing? And I'm like, you're not from Colorado. And he's like, I'm looking for a guy named Jack. And my manager is sitting right here on the phone, and I'm like, what's his last name? And my manager goes like this to me. And we had a beer mug full of breath mints, and I turned it so the handle was facing me because I was going to hit the guy in the head with it. And I was like, what's his last name? He's like, I don't know. I'm like, what's your business with him? He's like, I called in. He has some tickets for me. And I was like, oh, yeah, so like, oh, yeah, I'm Jack. And he's like, what do you think I was a cop? And I said, nope, wasn't concerned you were a cop at all. So I gave him the stuff, and then, of course, I had my manager call me down to his office, and I had to explain a little bit about that. But that was my life, and it was just something that you lived. And so as time got on, I moved back and forth to Colorado. My mom would, she'd separate from my father. They'd try to make things work, and then we'd come back to Colorado, or we'd come back to New York, and then things wouldn't go. And then, so finally, I don't remember what year it was, and honestly, like from 91 to like 97, my life's really a blur. I remember events, but dates completely escape me. I don't remember how old I was. I don't remember what happened first. But the biggest thing was the uncertainty. There was no stability. I never knew what tomorrow would bring. Some people are like, oh, I might have to change the oil in my car tomorrow. Me, it was like, I might be in Kansas tomorrow, from New York or whatever. And during that time, there were some other things going on that I didn't know about, but the state was looking to take me from my parents. And so my mom told me at the time, she said, if you get called down to the office at school, I want you to run. And she said, you won't be in trouble, but if they call you down to the front office, I don't care if you have to go out an emergency exit. I don't care if you have to push teachers. She said, you run into the woods. And I was like, all right, And, you're talking about like a 7 or 8-year-old kid that you're saying this to. Now, my brothers, they were going to high school up the road, and there was a river that connected it. So me and my brothers, we were always planning like these crazy like military tactics. And we were like, all right, listen, I'm going to go, because if they were coming for me, they were coming for them. We were going to dip into the river. We were going to follow the river up. We were going to rendezvous, and we had this whole plan. And it probably wouldn't have worked at all like we thought it would, but we had a plan. And then one day, I got a phone call. I got a call over the loudspeaker at school. It said, well, Jack Fayel, please come to the office. And I just remember my heart just absolutely sinking. And, when you're a kid, your parents tell you one thing, but the teachers are telling you to do something else, and you're like, you don't know who to obey. You don't want to get in trouble. So I remembered walking to the end of the hall, and when you got to the end of the hall, you turn all the way down. The offices were 25 yards down the hallway, and I kind of got to the corner, and I peeked around the corner, and I saw my mother standing at the door of the office. So I ran up to my mom, and I was like, Mom, what's going on? I said, hi, I was excited to see her. She's like, all right, come with me, and she took me by the hand, and I didn't even get my stuff out of my desk at school. I didn't say goodbye to my friends. I didn't say anything to my teachers. We just walked out to the car, and sitting out in the car were my sister, my brother, and the trunk and the back window of the car was full of luggage. We got in the car, we drove straight to my grandparents' house. Got out, my dad was there, my grandpa was there, they were both crying, they gave us a hug, we got in the car and we left. I didn't even know where we were going. Obviously, I figured out we were probably going to Colorado, but we drove all the way to Colorado because apparently there was a warrant that was issued for the state to remove me from the home. But because the judge knew my dad, because my dad was a very respected law enforcement figure in our community, the judge called him and said, I can't do anything about this warrant, but I want to let you know that I'm signing it right now. So that was boom, and next thing you know, I'm in Colorado. And that happened several times in my life. And in fact, when I was living in Colorado, the exact same thing happened. My mom and my dad, they weren't talking, and there was just some crazy stuff going on. And my dad showed up in Colorado one day, and he was like, hey, I'm here, we're going to, we went out to dinner. He's like, I'm going to talk to your mom, we're going to work things out, we're going to be a family again, it's going to be great. He's like, why don't you spend the night at the hotel with me, and we'll come and have breakfast with Mom in the morning. And so me and my brother Louie, we said, yeah. So we spent the night at my dad's hotel room, and we woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't remember what time of year it was. It was winter. There was snow on the ground. I don't remember what year it was. We got in the car, and we left. And I didn't see my mother or nothing. My dad just came and literally kidnapped us from Colorado. And we drove straight through back to New York. And things were just a roller coaster ride for me. And I had such abandonment issues. I really struggled with my self-worth, and my parents, and again, no disrespect to them, but when you have a divorce that ugly, they pin the kids against each other, and you get pulled in every direction. And so I had no foundation for what reality was in a family structure. So as I got older, and I decided to stay with my father, and I lived with my dad for a number of years. Because I moved so much, and because the way I left Colorado several times, all my school records had been lost from school. So everything I had, and I hated school at this point, I absolutely hated it, but I wanted to get through. I wanted to graduate. I was looking forward to a cap and gown ceremony, so I was at least trying to graduate, a solid C+ student. And so all my school records were lost. So my guidance counselor, he remembered me from school. He's like, I can't find them. I even went back to my elementary school. There was no records of Jack Fiala ever attending school in the United States of America. So because of that, I was forced to drop out of school and go to a trade school to get my GED, which was also damaging to me. And it was at that school where things really started to change for me, because my dad had been whooping on me, my brothers had been whooping on me, everybody had been whooping on me, and all they had done in the past 15, 20 years was just make me a tough individual. And I realized that I was nobody's punching bag, and tables started to turn, and I started to fight back. And I realized that I was pretty good at it. And I was certainly tough enough to where even if I didn't win, they didn't feel like they won. And I started to get empowered by that. It became like a drug for me, because I started to see fear in other people's eyes. And it was something I'd never experienced before, so it was like something that I really was like, I craved it. I never did drugs. I wasn't the guy that was always running around with half a dozen different women. My drug was just fear in other people. So I just walked around everywhere like I had a chip on my shoulder. And so I started, once I got out of the trade school, I got a job as an EMT, which really became a big part of my life, and something that I really enjoyed doing. I did like helping people and stuff, and being an EMT was, I didn't really know fully what I was getting myself into. But again, what this is a slow fade. So what's happened so far is I felt scared, I felt unsafe, but there was another dimension that was coming where now I was an angry, very, very angry individual. And the devil just kept adding things to the pile, and he kept turning the rudder of the ship very, very slowly. So I'm working with the ambulance, and when you're doing that line of work, you see things that you wish you didn't see, and you have things burned into your memory that you wish weren't there. And I've seen a lot of messed up things, and I've seen what other people can do to people. And I've seen what people can do to themselves. And what was happening was my conscience was being seared. Death was becoming normal to me. It wasn't something that I was, I can't even tell you how many crime scenes I've been on, or fatal car accidents, all sorts of stuff. And when you see that, you get numb to it. You have to, otherwise it's going to affect you more than it affected me. So we had some family friends that were coming up from New York City, and I started hanging out with them. And I started going down to Brooklyn a lot on my free time. And I kind of saw what was going on, but I was in denial about it because these individuals were, they were, well, to put it bluntly, they were messing around with the mob. And, excuse me. And again, I started to get immersed in this, almost like this mob-like culture, but it wasn't like it was in the movies, where everybody's trying to kill everybody, and then there's drugs and all this other stuff. It was like they were cool people to hang around. We'd walk into restaurants, we'd get the best tables, we'd ate at some fantastic food, which is something I still miss. But I started hanging around them, and they knew me, they knew my father and stuff like that. And one day, I got called down to Brooklyn. And I went into this neighborhood, and I couldn't even tell you the neighborhood now, and I couldn't even remember where it was. But I remember very distinctly, I got out of the car, and there was a Mercedes parked in front of this little cafe. Honestly, almost looked like the Terracotta a little bit. And there was this Mercedes, brand new Mercedes parked there, and it was running. And I remember thinking, what kind of an idiot would leave their car running in this neighborhood? And I walked into this little cafe place, and there was nobody was really there. There was some girl there, was tending bar. And we walked up, and this gentleman that brought me there, he's like, come with me. We walk behind the bar, and we go through the back. And we opened the door, and this was just like the movies. I opened the door, and all I see are craps tables, poker tables, slot machines. It was like this huge underground gambling operation. And I remember thinking, oh, crap. I know where I'm at. And they walk in, and there was a guy way in the back who saw me. He knew me when I was a little kid. And he comes running up, speaking Italian. He barely spoke English. He's grabbing me, kissing me, slapping me in the face, as Italians do. So we sit down, and he starts talking to the gentleman that brought me down there. And they're speaking in Italian. And I don't speak Italian, but I can understand it a little bit. And what he's saying is that we need fresh blood. We need somebody like him. He comes from a good stock. He's come from a good family. And what they were doing was they were talking about bringing me in to their organization. To what capacity, I have no clue. So we left, and I was kind of faced with this decision. And you would think that this decision would be very, very simple to do. It would be a no-brainer. And I was like, obviously I need to think about it. And I hadn't been involved enough to really not be able to get out of it. I did, I was involved a little bit with some things, but not enough to where I wasn't able to walk away. But this question that was asked to me I wouldn't have been able to walk away. And so I started to think about it. And when I was in Colorado, my mother became a Christian, and she went to church. So when I was in Colorado, I was exposed to the things of God. I was exposed to church and all this other stuff. So I had a head knowledge of who Jesus was, and if you'd asked me if I was a Christian, I'd have said yes, and I'd have been able to throw every Bible verse at you that says that I am Christian. But it was all up here. It hadn't gotten here yet. So, as ridiculous as this sounds, I remember thinking about it, and I was like, Lord, what should I do? You got to pray about just big decisions in your life. And it just so happened that week, I had this long run. We had a batch of bad heroin in town. And there were people that were dropping left and right from overdoses. And that week, I remember I was on the scene of I think it was 8 heroin overdoses and 2 fatal car accidents. And at that point, I was just so dead inside. I was so numb from just a life of hurt and rejection and all this other stuff. And I remembered thinking about, there was this girl that had overdosed, and she couldn't have been 90 pounds. She was a beautiful young girl, early 20s, and she was laying in the middle of this house there was no furniture, it was a crack house, and she was just laying there. And I remember looking at her, and there was nothing I could do for her. And I remember standing over her, and I remember thinking, what happened to you? How did you get here? And I just felt so cold. I felt so numb. I didn't care about anything anymore. And so at this point, I was an alcoholic. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I mean, I was in rough shape. And I hated life. I hated myself. I hated everything. I was angry. And I thought, you know what? If I'm going to be angry, if I'm going to see death all the time, I may as well make money doing it, because I sure wasn't making money working on an ambulance, because they make minimum wage. And so I thought, you know what? What they're asking me to do, these people probably deserve it anyway. This little girl didn't deserve it. This person that died in the car accident, they didn't deserve it. But there's plenty of people in the world that deserve it. You know, this is me putting my judgment on them. I'm starting to decide who's worth it and who's not. And so I was like, you know what? I can get respect. I can have money. I can have power. And I was like, you know what? This doesn't sound like a bad idea. So one night, again, I was at work with the ambulance. And everything I'm saying to you now happened within a 3 or 4 week period. I was at work, and it was just bad. It was just a bad run. And I got home that day, and I remember I'd get home every day. This is my ritual. I'd get home, and I'd pour a shot of whiskey, and I would drink it. I'd pour another shot, and I'd drink it. And I would basically drink myself till I passed out, because I couldn't sleep otherwise. And I wake up the next morning, I go to work, and I do it again. But I felt numb. I felt like I was hollow. And so I got home this one particular night, and I did what I always did. I grabbed this big old bottle of Jack Daniels, and I remembered looking at it, and I thought to myself, I hate this stuff. I hate it. I don't like the way it smells. I don't like the way it tastes. I don't like the way it makes me feel. But I don't have anything else. It was just anesthetizing where I was at. So I went over and I grabbed one of my father's handguns. I loaded it up, and I'm sitting there, and I have the bottle of whiskey here, and I'm holding this revolver like this, and I'm looking at him, and I'm literally having this conversation in my living room, and I'm like, if I drink this, I'm going to wake up tomorrow, and I'm going to do this all over again. It's a never-ending cycle. But this, I don't have to wake up tomorrow. The pain could be over. And I didn't fear death. I had no fear about much of anything at that point in my life. And it seemed soothing. It seemed like it was a good thing. And I remembered sitting there, and I was in a dark living room. It was at night. It was 11 o'clock at night. It was raining that night. And all of a sudden, I just started to think back on all the stuff I heard when I was a kid, the seeds that everybody probably tried sowing in me but knew wouldn't go anywhere. I will say this. On my mother's side, I had a praying grandmother. And I'm telling you, Desmond knows. You don't stand a chance when you got one of those. That woman, I'm telling you, that woman one time, she had these peach trees, and it started to hail. And I was a kid, and she stepped out on the porch in Colorado, and she yelled up at the sky, and she's like, in the name of Jesus, you stop that. And it stopped. And I'm like, you know, that stuck with me. I'm like, all right. So that was the woman that was praying for me, so I didn't stand a chance. So I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I started thinking about all the things that I went through and everything like that. And I said, God, where are you? And all of a sudden, the whole atmosphere of the room just changed. And I can't even describe it to you. It was like this peace entered the room. And I heard, and it wasn't audible. I tell you that, it wasn't audible, but if it was audible, it would have been that impressive to me, because anybody can talk to your ears, but God talks to a part of your heart that only God can speak to. You know? If someone breaks wind, you're going to hear it with your ears. It's not that impressive. But when God speaks to that part of the heart that only God can speak to, you know that the God of the universe just spoke to you. You won't question it. And I heard him say, where have you been? And I'm like, well, I took some side roads, I guess, and we started to have this conversation. And I was talking out loud to God, and thank God there was nobody around, because I'd be in an asylum right now. So I'm pacing back and forth in my living room. I got a bottle of whiskey in this hand. I have a loaded revolver in this hand, and I'm just going back and forth. And I say, God, you know, I've tried to do good. I've done this, I've done this, I've done that, and blah, 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 blah. And I heard him say, depart from me, for I never knew you. And I was like, oh, well, I knew that scripture too. And I was like, Lord, I'm broken. I'm an empty vessel. I have nothing to live for. I hate what I've become. I hate myself. I hate a lot of people I work with. And I just started to, I had this vision, and I don't know if it was real or not, to be honest with you, but this was a very visual, and when I think back on it, it was like watching a movie. But I saw this like cobblestone alleyway, and it was raining. And I saw this figure of what I understood to be Christ walking away from me. And I was like, Lord, and as I did that, the atmosphere in the room changed again. And this dark living room got darker. And it literally got so dark that you could taste the darkness. I don't know how to describe it. This darkness filled the living room, and I felt like as if you were wading into cold water. I just felt this cold feeling start coming up my body. And all of a sudden, I felt these hands around my throat, and I started to not be able to breathe. And I dropped the bottle, I dropped the gun, I dropped to my knees, and I remembered looking at this vision of Jesus walking away, and I was trying to reach out, but I couldn't get to him. And I started to cry out for Jesus. And I was like, and every time I'd say Jesus, my throat would, and I'd go, Jesus, you know. And finally, I was able to just, Jesus. And the hands broke off of me. And I remembered quickly, it was like somebody like from the sidelines was like, give me a cue card. Tell him he's your Savior, you know? Like, right. And I was like, Lord, I need you right now. And this was absolutely a foxhole conversion, because there was something that was trying to kill me that night. And I was like, Lord, but I meant it so much that I mean it. I said, Father God, I said, I need you to be Lord over my life. And I realized I had never said that before. And that was the missing part. I never invited him into my heart. We were friends. We were pals. I used to pray all the time when I was doing all sorts of dumb stuff. But it was like God was my like lucky charm. Christ was my lucky charm. But I was like, and then when I said that, all of a sudden, I heard what sounded like a logging chain get stretched so far that it snapped. It was like this pink. It blew apart. And I heard chains hit the ground. And all of a sudden, I took this deep breath that I had never taken in 24 years of life. I just was like, and all of a sudden, this weight lifted off of me, and I broke through something that night that was just, these chains had fallen off of me. And I heard the Lord say, now I can begin my work in you. And I remember just sitting there in the living room, and I was like, what on earth just happened? And like I've always heard about people's conversions and stuff like that, and I sat down on the couch, and I'm looking around, and I felt alive. I felt like I could feel again. I felt like there was something in me that wasn't dead. And so I showed up to work the next day, and everybody's like, And I was like, what? They're like, what happened to you? And I'm like, nothing. Like, you look different. I'm like, you look different. Get away from me. I wasn't sanctified yet. I was just saved. So I was like, and literally everybody I talked to, you look different. I'm like, okay. And I'm like, all right, this is something happened here. So I tried going to a couple churches in the area, like trying to figure something out. And believe it or not, I had been to Lighthouse before because Louis was going to college up here, my brother. And, excuse me, I think it was like 2002, 2003 I first came to Lighthouse. Nothing about it stood out. I wouldn't even call it a good church. Not that it was a bad one, I just didn't, I sat in the back, kept to myself. And I was like, okay. But I was laying in bed at work. I worked in an ambulance, don't worry. we were allowed to sleep. And all of a sudden, God woke me up at about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I heard clearer than I've ever heard God speak to me before. He said, go to Alfred right now. And I was like, okay. And I knew that I had to do that. I didn't know why. I was like, okay. So I got up. The only person I knew in Alfred was my brother and Peter Stahl, because he was the only one that ever talked to me at church. He'd stand right there. So all the way home, I'm thinking, my dad's going to think I'm nuts. He's not going to understand this. He's going to think I'm nuts. I'm going to have to explain all this to him. I don't want to explain all this to him. And I'm just flipping out all the way home. And I come walking in the door, and he's just getting up for coffee, and he meets me in the middle of the kitchen, and I'm like, and he's like, aren't you supposed to be at work? And I was like, I have to move to Alfred. And he was like, I know. And I was like, what? Who told you? You know? And I couldn't, that alone was a miracle right there. And I was like, all right. So I went and I grabbed a garbage bag. I threw all my clean clothes with my dirty clothes. I grabbed my guitar, threw it in the back of my car, and I drove straight to Alfred. Didn't stop. Halfway up here, I got a flat tire while I was doing like, I don't know, the speed limit. And I got out of the car, and I was weak. I was going through alcohol withdrawals. I did not want to be changing a tire. And I remembered I had AAA. And I pulled out my AAA card, and I tell you, it expired the next day. And I was like, so I called AAA. This guy shows up in this slushy rainstorm, and I'm standing out there with him. And because my pride is hurt as a man, I was like, you know, I know how to change a tire. And he's like, well, then why didn't you, you know? So we come all the way up. I get to Alfred, and I showed up at Louis' front door, and I was like, can I live with you? He's like, yeah, come on in. And I spent like 3 solid days on his couch sleeping. I hadn't slept in months. And I drank every bit of Alka-Seltzer he had in the house because all I wanted was whiskey. And finally, I showed up in church. And I remember Pastor Roger, after church, came up to me. I know he's watching right now. And Pastor, you think that you had that word over me when I first came here. It was actually 1.5 years since I've been here that you gave me that word. The first day I came here, Pastor came up to me and he was like, hey, you want to get coffee sometime? And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And I never thought in a million years he'd actually do it. And he called me, I think it was a Tuesday. He's like, hey, you want to get coffee? And I was like, sure. By the way, I still had this whole decision hanging over my head because I had just left a lot of people in New York City scratching their head, and I didn't tell anybody where I went. So we went to the Terracotta, got a cup of coffee, went upstairs, and I found myself spilling my guts to a man I didn't know. And I was like, I don't even know why I'm saying this. Like, I'm not somebody that talks about that type of stuff. And Pastor, in true Pastor Roger form, he's like, okay, well, praise the Lord, you're here now. So what are you going to do? And I was like, I don't know, you know. And then, so I got saved, and then I started being discipled, and there was a huge difference in my life, and things really started to come off of me. And honestly, I was radically transformed. Let me just... So, not all of you have a crazy story. And honestly, you've only heard maybe 40% of the story. But the point is this, is that everybody here has a story. Everybody here has a testimony. And yours may not be as crazy as mine, and mine not be as crazy as yours. But what matters is that we all need Jesus. I didn't need anybody telling me that I was messed up because I knew I was messed up. But if your testimony isn't as crazy as mine, you may not know you're not messed up. You may not know you need Jesus. If you're from a good family, you're from a good home, life for the most part is going good for you, got news for you, you need Jesus. And I want to say that whatever your testimony is, don't minimize it. Don't minimize it, because it's used to minister to people. That's what it is. It's like, it's like food for people. You have people that are on different diets, okay? That's probably a pastor saying, will you tell him to cut it short? So, you have people that are on different diets, right? And your testimony is going to reach different people. I'm not going to reach the same people that you might reach, Jacob. But don't minimize your testimony. Because the people that you can minister to, I can't. And if you allow God to take your situation and give it to Him, if you allow Him to come into your heart, if you allow Him to take control of your life, then all of a sudden your problem, your disparity, your emptiness now becomes a vessel. When you're ground, you now become bread for people. You can now feed the hurting, the broken. And God wants to do that in each and every one of you. Like Pastor said, we're all called to be ministers. All of us. So if you sit there and you're thinking about what's going on in your heart, you're thinking about what's going on in your life, and if you don't know Christ, you need to. And if you do know Christ, you need to let Him take your struggle and make it a testimony. So I just want to encourage you guys today that think about what you've been through. Think about the struggles in your life, and think about what God has done through you, with you, for you, and try to find the people that can absorb what your life experience and what you've been through can help them. So that's pretty much it. But I just want to really encourage you guys that no matter your situation, nothing is too big for Christ. Nothing. No situation. There's no place that you can go that He can't get to you. There's nothing you can do that He can't undo. And if you're living with the consequences of sin, God can still use that. There's people sitting in prison right now that are paying for what they did in the natural, but God can still use them. Everybody here has a testimony. And it's a powerful testimony because it's not about us, it's about Christ. It's all right. So, yeah, about Christ. Praise Jesus. So I hope you guys are blessed. I hope I was able to speak to somebody. Sorry if I was long-winded, but just be encouraged and know that Christ has a plan for all of you.